Living in a pre-war apartment building in Chicago has its charms. Crown molding, high ceilings, and thick walls. But by December 2018, I realized those walls weren't thick enough. I was a residency student at the time, working grueling hours at the hospital. New Year's Eve was just another Monday to me because I had a 4 a.m. shift. I needed sleep more than I needed a celebration. By 10 p.m., the ceiling began to vibrate. It wasn't just music, it was the rhythmic thud of a heavy bass line that felt like a heartbeat in my skull. I checked the unit number, 402. I'd lived there for 8 months and had never even seen the tenant. I figured they were just throwing a massive bash for the holiday. I tried earplugs, then white noise, but by 11:30 p.m., the noise changed. It transitioned from music to the sounds of a chaotic party, the distinct clink of hundreds of glasses, dozens of overlapping voices laughing, and the sound of furniture being dragged across the floor. Then came the screaming. It sounded like happy screaming, the kind people do when a favorite song comes on, but it was piercing. Driven by a mix of exhaustion and rage, I went upstairs. The fourth-floor hallway was freezing. One light fixture was flickering, casting long, rhythmic shadows. As I approached door 402, I noticed something odd. There was no light coming from under the door, no muffled music, just a dead, heavy silence that shattered the second I knocked. The moment my knuckle hit the wood, the door creaked open. It hadn't been latched. The apartment was a void. I stepped inside, my phone flashlight cutting through a thick layer of dust dancing in the air. There was no party, no people, no furniture. The smell was the worst part. Not cigarettes or alcohol, but the smell of stagnant water and old copper. In the center of the living room sat a vintage 1990s boombox. It was plugged into an outlet that looked half melted. It was playing a cassette tape. I leaned in and realized the party I heard was a loop. A 5-second clip of a woman laughing, a glass breaking, and a man saying, "Is it midnight yet?" over and over. I ejected the tape and threw it across the room. Silence. I went back to my apartment, heart hammering, and locked my deadbolt. At 11:59 p.m., I sat in the dark. Precisely at midnight, the party started again. But this time, it wasn't the boombox. It was the sound of someone directly above my bed, barefoot, sprinting in circles. I moved out the following week. My landlord later confirmed that the previous tenant had been found on New Year's Day 3 years prior. She had died of a heart attack during her own party, and no one noticed for days because the music was so loud. I live in a part of rural Ohio where neighbors are people you see once a month at the grocery store. My house is surrounded by cornfields that, in December, look like jagged rows of teeth under the moonlight. To keep my seasonal depression at bay, I started a tradition, the Midnight Mile. On December 31st, at 11:50 p.m., the temperature had dropped to 18 degrees. I geared up in my thermal running gear, strapped on my headlamp, and hit the asphalt. The silence of a rural winter is heavy. The only sound is the crunch of your own breath freezing in the air. About half a mile down County Road 12, there's a single buzzing sodium lamp. As I approached, I saw a tall, thin silhouette. My first thought was drunk local. But as I got closer, the details didn't fit. The man was wearing a high-end tuxedo. No coat, no gloves, no hat. He was standing perfectly still, facing the fields, his hands behind his back. I slowed my pace. "Happy New Year," I called out, my voice sounding thin in the wind. He didn't turn. He didn't even shiver. As I passed him, his head tracked me, slowly, like a security camera, but his body remained frozen. His eyes were wide, reflecting my headlamp like an animal's. I hit my 1-mile mark and turned around. I wanted to get home, fast. When I reached the street lamp again, he was gone. I felt a surge of relief until I looked about 50 yards ahead. He was standing in the middle of the road now. In his right hand, he held a pair of long-handled industrial bolt cutters. They looked brand new, the steel glinting in the moonlight. I stopped dead. I didn't want to run towards him, but the fields on either side were fenced with barbed wire. I decided to sprint. I moved to the very edge of the shoulder, keeping my eyes locked on his hands. As I tore past him at a full gallop, he didn't swing the cutters. He didn't even move. He just whispered, "The year is over. Let's cut the ties." I didn't stop until I slammed my front door. I checked the windows, saw nothing, and tried to convince myself it was a weird performance art piece or a local eccentric. At 12:05 p.m., I went to the kitchen to get water. My motion sensor floodlight in the driveway kicked on. I looked out the window. My car was sitting low. I put on my boots and went out with a flashlight. All 4 tires hadn't just been slashed. The metal valve stems had been cleanly snipped off with bolt cutters. Propped up against my windshield was a small, torn piece of a tuxedo sleeve. On it, written in black marker, was, "Now you stay in last year." My friends and I, Sarah, Mike, and Chloe, decided to skip the bars and rent a smart cabin in the Poconos. It was a glass and steel marvel tucked into a dense forest. The owner, Marcus, told us over the app that the house was fully automated. Everything from the fireplace to the window shades was controlled by a master iPad in the kitchen. The first few hours were great, but around 11:30 p.m., the house started acting glitchy. The lights in the basement would dim and brighten in a slow, rhythmic pulse. Then the smart fridge started dispensing ice uncontrollably, spilling cubes all over the kitchen floor. We laughed it off as bad Wi-Fi until 11:15 p.m. The intercom system, built into every room, chirped. A voice, distorted by static but sounding like a young man, said, "I'm at the gate. The code isn't working." We checked the iPad's exterior camera feed. The driveway was empty. The gate, half a mile down the private road, showed nothing but snow. Mike used the intercom to say, "Hey, you have the wrong house." The voice replied instantly, "No, I'm looking at you right now, Mike. Put the champagne down." We froze. Mike was holding the bottle. We looked at the interior camera icons on the iPad. All of them said, "Disabled by admin," but the tiny blue LED lights on the wall-mounted cameras were all glowing. We were being watched. I tried to call the police, but there was no cell service in the valley, and the house's smartphone line was dead. Suddenly, the iPad began playing audio files. It was us, from an hour ago. We heard our own laughter, our private jokes, and then a sound we hadn't heard at the time, the sound of heavy breathing very close to the microphone. At 11:45 p.m., the smart locks on the front and back doors hummed and slid open simultaneously. We ran to lock them manually, but the electronic motors kept forcing the deadbolts back. It was a tug of war with an invisible hand. Then, the iPad flashed a new notification. Occupancy sensor tripped. Subfloor maintenance tunnel. We heard a heavy thud from beneath the kitchen island. A metal grate in the floor began to unscrew from the inside. We didn't wait to see who was coming out. We grabbed our keys and sprinted for the SUV. As we pulled away from the house, I looked back, and every light in the cabin was flashing SOS in perfect synchronization. In 2019, I was working as an unlicensed private taxi for a group of college kids in a snowy town in Vermont. It was an easy way to make $500 in a night. My rule was simple: stay in the car, keep the doors locked, and only pick up the people on my list. At 1:30 a.m., I was waiting in a dark cul-de-sac for a group to leave a house party. The street was lined with parked cars covered in a foot of snow. My windows were starting to fog, so I reached for the defrost. That's when I noticed a snow pile about 20 feet ahead of me move. It wasn't a snow pile. It was a person in a white ghillie suit, the kind hunters use. They were crouched between two parked cars, perfectly camouflaged. I watched, paralyzed, as they crawled on their stomach toward the back of my SUV. I heard a faint thud against my bumper. I checked my rear-view mirror. Nothing. My backup camera was obscured by snow. I was about to put the car in drive and bolt when my passenger door opened. It was one of the college kids, a girl named Maya, looking pale and drunk. She hopped in, shivering. Go, just drive," she whispered. As I pulled away, I told her about the person in white. She turned around and looked through the back window, then screamed, "He's on the roof!" I slammed on the brakes. A man in a white suit slid off the roof and onto the hood. He didn't have a weapon. He had a GoPro strapped to his head and a roll of duct tape. He stared at us through the windshield with a look of pure, calm focus. Not anger, just calculation. I put the car in reverse and floored it, throwing him off. When I got home, I found that he had managed to duct tape a small GPS tracker to my roof rack. He wasn't trying to rob me. He was tagging lone drivers to see where they lived once the party ended. I decided to spend New Year's 2022 alone at a remote Airbnb in the Appalachian Mountains to reset my life. The cabin was beautiful, but the host, a guy named Silas, lived in a smaller house about 200 yards down the trail. On New Year's Eve, Silas knocked on my door around 8 p.m. He was holding a bottle of homemade cider. He seemed lonely, so I let him in for 10 minutes. He kept talking about cleansing the past and asking me if I had any regrets I wanted to leave behind in the old year. It was creepy, but I figured he was just a quirky mountain guy. After he left, I went to bed early. At exactly 11:55 p.m., I was woken up by the sound of heavy objects hitting the side of the cabin. Thwack, thwack. I looked out the window. Silas was standing in the clearing, throwing large, heavy stones at the cabin. But he wasn't looking at the windows. He was looking at the roof. I realized he was systematically breaking the shingles over the kitchen area. Then the smell hit me. Not smoke, but chemicals. I ran to the kitchen and saw a dark liquid seeping through the ceiling where he had broken the tiles. He was pouring gasoline into the attic space. I grabbed my keys and ran for the back door, but it was jammed from the outside with a wooden stake. I had to smash a side window and crawl out, cutting my hands in the process. I hid in the woods and watched as he stood there at midnight, not with a lighter, but with a camera. He didn't light the fire. He just wanted to see me panic and shed my old skin. When the police arrived, they found a journal in his house with photos of the last 6 guests. He had done something different to each one, locking one in the cellar, cutting the brakes of another, calling it his New Year's therapy. I'm a moderator for a small local Community Watch Facebook group in a suburban town in Oregon. On New Year's Eve, the feed is usually full of complaints about fireworks and lost dogs. At 11:50 p.m., a user with no profile picture posted a photo. It was a high-resolution shot of a street sign in our neighborhood. The caption was, "Who wants to play a game before the clock strikes?" I thought it was a prank, so I ignored it. At 11:54 p.m., he posted another photo. This one was of a house, my neighbor's house. The front door was wide open. I looked out my window. My neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, was away visiting her daughter. Her door was open, swinging in the wind. I commented, "I'm calling the police." The user instantly replied with a photo of me looking out my window. The photo was taken from the bushes in my own front yard. The caption read, "You're too fast. I haven't finished the countdown." I ducked away from the window, grabbed my shotgun, and locked myself in the bathroom. I called 911, but the lines were jammed with New Year's calls. At 11:59 p.m., my phone buzzed. A final notification from the group. It was a photo of my bathroom door from the hallway side. The caption was, "Happy New Year." The power cut out to my house. I sat in the dark, hearing the fireworks exploding outside, masking the sound of the bathroom door handle turning slowly. The only reason I'm alive is because my golden retriever, who I thought was hiding in the tub, launched himself at the door, barking with a ferocity I'd never heard. The intruder fled. The police found a burglary kit in Mrs. Gable's house, but they also found something else. A digital clock set to 12 o'clock, rigged to a recording of a human heartbeat that stopped when the timer hit 0.